All right, finally have things up and running. And our class numbers seem to be dwindling close to the end of the semester. Well, I guess it is paper season, so people are stressing, no doubt. So we got through the Neo-Assyrians, we got through the Neo-Babylonians, and now we are setting the stage for the Persians, looking at the Iron Age of Iran. Actually, I guess we will be looking at the Persians too. Uh, hello. Pop-ups everywhere. Stop. All right. So even though we're kind of done with our map quizzes, just to continue on so that you know where exactly these places are. The two main sites that I'm going to talk about at the beginning will be Hassanlu, which is just sort of the southeast corner of Lake Urmia. And then this weird site called Marlik, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere, in one of the valleys in the Elborz Mountains, like just south of the Caspian Sea. And then afterwards, we will move down south and we'll look at Pasargadae and Persepolis. All right. So we've been slowly moving east, and we finished in Babylon and Mesopotamia proper last few classes, and now we're moving east into Iran, in what we call the Iron Age. I say, Iron Age sort of, because the Iron One period of Iran, again, this is the weirdness of chronology and stuff like that. The Iron One period, which is generally usually seen as a transition from the Late Bronze to the Iron Age, starts about 1450, kind of like basically when the Late Bronze Age starts in the rest of the Near East. So Iron One is chronologically, traditionally in the period of the LBA. And this is all a little weird, so bear with me. Because, well, it's issues that we still haven't quite sorted out. When we were last in Iran in the Bronze Ages, we had the Elamites, we had the Hurrians, and a whole host of other groups sort of in the region. And we know that all of these groups, one thing we can say about all these groups is that none of them spoke an Indo-European language group, like the Hittites or something like that. And they didn't speak a Semitic language either. If anything, they seem to have been kind of a mixed bag ethnically. We have no written records for Iran, and the few records we have from Mesopotamia in the late Bronze Age are basically few and far between. So we don't really have a lot of data to make sense of the period. So again, we're dealing with one of these dark ages, although this one starts earlier and is a little bit longer. It's different from the dark age of the transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age and the rest of the Near East, because Iran was always its own kind of separate entity, and it did have trading contacts, it did have forays, military forays from either groups, either into the Zagros or out of the Zagros. And you did have that large Elamite Empire or Elamite Kingdom, whatever you want to call it, but we never really have had a good handle on Iran, and really that's the result of the lack of research in the area for so long because of the Iranian Revolution. So once the veil lifts, so to speak, of that dark age, we now know that we have Indo-European Iranian speakers basically spread out all over Iran. And that is really it was the driving force in like the 60s and 70s behind Iranian archaeology. And it really is one of the big questions that people have is like, when did the first Iranians, that is Farsi or Persian speakers, sort of come into Iran? And I'll just skip my usual little joke there. So prior to 1957, we have no evidence for when this would have really happened. Iran was basically terra incognita, except for Susa, really. The first excavations, unfortunately, like I said, were like we looked at in class, were undertaken by the French and by a man by the name of Roman Girschman, whose name will come back to haunt us over and over again. And And once again, sorry, the first excavations that were outside of Susa, that is, are at the site of Tepe Seal. Once again, we have the site that was found because of a whole slew of metal artifacts that started showing up in the antiquities market. It's a very common theme, as we've seen, and they eventually traced it back to Tepe Seal. And so Gershman set up excavations basically where everybody was looting, which turned out to actually just be a cemetery. The site itself has never really been excavated, but the graves produced archaeological material that they didn't really recognize. And since some iron objects were found in the deposits alongside the stuff, they assumed that it must be dated to the Iron Age. And this was sort of the first sort of dipping the toes into the archaeology of the Iron Age. As more surveys and excavations were undertaken in the region, they realized that in northwestern Iran, and this is what you have to keep in mind, is that you have sort of northwestern Iran, and then you have eastern Iran, and then you have southern Iran, which is its own other sort of kettle of fish. But in northwestern Iran, a new and highly distinctive and pretty long-lasting culture was recognized in the archaeological record. And it was identified through the introduction of a monochrome, well, first gray and red wares in a lot of these new ceramic shapes. And these shapes are completely new to the area. Nothing that had been seen previously with, the Elamites and the BMAC and all that stuff. They included spouted vessels, sort of like these teapots that you see on the left-hand side. Tall pedestal-based goblets with side handles. A bowl with sort of semicircular ridge on its interior. And yeah, there's a bunch of others. So this ceramic culture was a dramatic change from the previous late Bronze Age material. And so the naming of this period was known as Iron One, somewhat unfortunately, and somewhat confusingly. The main sort of establishment of the chronology of Iran was done by actually an old U of T professor here, T. Kyler Young. You've heard me mention him once before, where he was working at that site of Hassanlu that I showed you on the map, and he worked on the ceramic seriation. And this is what really set the chronology, if you will, especially the ceramic chronology for northwestern Iran. So Young's work divided the ceramic assemblage into three different groups: what he called early Western Greyware horizon, late Western Gray horizon, and early Western buff. He left kind of chronology out of it all because there wasn't really enough chronological data that you could really sort of say what it dated to. But it was his PhD advisor, essentially, a man by the name of Robert Dyson, that basically changed this kind of cumbersome early Western Gray, late Western Gray, early Western buff to Iron 1, Iron 2, Iron 3. Now, it's important to remember that this Iron 1, this early Western Greyware, there's no iron in this Iron 1 period. And all the radiocarbon dates seem to put its beginnings in Iran sometime around 1450. Iron really doesn't really sort of make its appearance in Iran until about the 9th century, kind of like the rest of the Near East. But we'll come to that mess in a little bit. Yeah. So the origin of the Iron 1 culture or early Western Greyware culture is crucial, but it's still really an unresolved problem. New work in Azerbaijan is perhaps clarifying things a little bit more nowadays. The big question is, when does this intrusion of the early Western early Western Greyware culture happen, and does it represent the intrusion of the Iranian speakers into Western Iran? Iranian is an Indo-European language, so it's believed that they must have entered Iran from the north, since Indo-Europeans are sort of in the homeland was in southern Ukraine, southern Russia. And so they must have come in from the north. Some scholars argue for a sort of a north Western Caucasus route, if you will. Others propose a sort of a northeastern one that goes along the east side of the Caspian Sea through Turkmenistan into eastern Iran, and then moving west from there. A number of sites in northwestern Iran and Azerbaijan have actually started to produce this Iron Age material, particularly the site of Haftavan Tepe and Goy Tepe. These two sites in particular give the most complete record for the period. Hasanlu and then Dinka Tepe. Oh, sorry, Dinka Tepe, which is near Hasanlu. Hasanlu, which we'll be looking at in a bit, preserves an extensive architectural and artifactual remains, as well as a cemetery. Dinka Tepe, which is just very close to Hasanlu, there's no point trying to put it on the map, is another sort of a cemetery, a very rich cemetery, and there's some fragments of some architecture. At these Iron One sites, or at least the Iron One levels at these sites, since many of them are multi-period, the start of the level is marked by the appearance of these gray ceramics, but also a new form of architecture with these column talls, often in this shape that is reminiscent of, our Greek megarons, or our, almost our temple in Antis kind of deal. So logic would say that if you want to trace the movement of these people who brought this grayware in an architectural form, we should be able to trace this assemblage across the landscape. So where do these graywares appear before northwestern Iran? If the Iranians came through the Caucasus, we'd expect to see them in the Caucasus, and we don't. Well, we didn't. Like I said, that might be changing in a little bit, but I'll come back to that. Looking east, though, we do sort of. If we look at northeastern Iran and southern Turkmenistan, bless you, we find groups of settlements which produce a very similar grayware culture, primarily the sites of Tepe Hisar, Torung Tepe, and Shah Tepe, where we have these grayware ceramics are found, but the megaron architecture is not. The third site, Marlik, is kind of an in-between the two things, and it was often seen as sort of the holy grail of trying to link the graywares of Hisar to the stuff from Hasanlu. It's found on the sort of the valleys that lead to the shores of the Caspian, along a corridor that really one would expect a culture if the Iranians had entered from the northeast and slowly made their ways west. But as we'll see, there's some issues with that. So starting in the east, looking at Tepe Hisar. This is the largest place in the Damghan Plain in northeastern Iran, situated just south of the Kopeta Mountains. Now, the excavations were undertaken by Eric Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania in 1931 and 32. And the sequence from Hisar covers a range from the 5th to the 2nd millennium BC. Now, Schmidt, to be kind, is to say he made a bit of a mess of the site. He has two ceramic phases that emerge from the excavations, one stratigraphically earlier than the other. So the stratigraphically earlier one was characterized by painted pottery, and the later one was by this black burnished and burnished gray ceramics, which is the ones that caught everybody's attention. So the Hisar level 1 stuff is this painted assemblage. Generally, it's this buff to light brown color with dark gray to red brown paint on them. Decorations are usually geometric with zigzags or herringbone patterns, but there are the odd examples of sort of zoomorphic designs that you're seeing like up there, particularly the depictions of goats. When it comes to Iranian pottery, whenever they have painted stuff, they seem to have a small obsession with goats with these giant curled horns. The shapes were often in these sort of pedestaled cups and bowls. And the architecture tends to be mud brick, small rectangular houses, all tightly cramped together. It gives you a look at, well, this is actually Hisar 2. The architecture is pretty similar to Hisar 1, perhaps thinner and more flimsy than 1. Ceramics consisted of limited painted wares, so very few of those painted wares that we saw in Hisar 1, but we have the explosion of these gray wares, particularly these tall stemmed cups, almost these champagne cups as they are sometimes called. Now, Schmidt believes that the grayware was the result of a large infiltration of people from the north, from the Gorgan Plain and the Turkmeni steppes to the north, basically moving down the east side of the Caspian. Now, this belief was based on the fact that concurrent to excavations at Hisar, you had excavations being undertaken in Turkmenistan on the other side of the Kopet Dağ Mountains at the sites of Turank Tepe, well, at the site of Turank Tepe, which was near Ashgabat, where they were finding basically an almost, a very, very similar, almost certainly related grayware culture at these sites. Along with the new pottery came change in burial customs, which is often, a good hint that there is a major change in culture happening. It's with Hisar 3 that we see the grayware basically take over completely. Level 3 is quite thick. It covered a long period of time, comprises of a lot of well-built architecture. And architecturally, you're looking at kind of a maze of buildings, often comprising of square rectangular rooms with a central hearth. The main architectural unit has been designated the burnt building, or the biggest building that they investigated was this one here, the burnt building on the side. It was oriented roughly northwest southeast. You can see that the walls kind of curve a little bit, although still somewhat rectangular in shape. The function of the structure is obviously unclear. There's some evidence which might suggest that it was a sanctuary, but most probably it was the residence, perhaps, of the prominent family or prominent individual of the town. This is the first level to produce a different form of architecture, larger and more elaborate than phases 1 or 2. 6 rooms make up the burnt building, comprising of sort of a main living room, a storeroom, a kitchen, and 2 small rooms of, well, God only knows what they could be. And then a tiny room that's, 2 other small rooms, a latrine and a room that they kind of called the wheat room because of the amount of charred wheat that was found on the surface. So level 3B was sacked and burnt. And the greatest evidence for this destruction comes from the burnt building. We have a ton of flint arrowheads were found in and around the burnt building, along with several copper daggers, and then the charred remains of one man, presumably one of the defenders of the buildings. Inside the structure, in room 5, the room that sort of connected rooms 1 and 7, you had 6 charred skeletons that were found. It's unsure whether these individuals died to some sort of inflicted wounds from attackers or whether they sort of succumbed to the smoke of the building as it burnt. We can't really say for sure. The following level is somewhat smaller, the 3C, and often sort of seen as sort of squatter in nature. It's been suggested that the inhabitants of 3C might even be the invaders who destroyed 3B. It's with the ceramics from 3C that we see perhaps the greatest affiliations with these iron one wares of Western Iran, in particular these teapots that you can see up there. In particular, like the most diagnostic thing about these teapots is the way that the back of the spout sort of reaches back and joins the rest of the body. It's a very sort of distinctive shape that you really only find in Iran in this period. So conceivably, we can see this point as the arrival of the Iranians into eastern Iran, and that then they moved west, where they eventually will show up at Hasanlu. Now, later traditions, literary traditions, particularly the Assyrians, put the homeland of the first Iranian speakers, those Medes that we talked about last class, or 2 classes ago, in the far east, in eastern Iran. And this apparent east-west link in the ceramic tradition seemed to work, well with the literary record. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. The major discrepancy was the chronology. The problem is that our Hisar 3C dates to the LBA, and that is the early part of the Late Bronze Age as well. Basically, they give us a date of 1885 for this 3C culture. Now, if you remember, the beginnings of the dates for the Iron One in Western Iran is 1450. So, a gap of 435 years, depending on, how much faith you put in these early C14 dates. So putting a 435-year gap between the possible bearers of this culture to basically traverse the length of the Caspian Sea, which is not very far, is a little hard to swallow. Basically, the distance between Hisar and Western Iran is probably, well, it's not really great. So 400 plus years is a little too long. And as well, when we look at the area in between the two sites, we have no evidence of this grayware culture along the southern end of the Caspian Sea. The culture appears in the east, ends in a destruction, and then reappears 400 years later in Western Iran. Sort of. First of all, I've been giving you the impression that the LBA wares of Eastern Iran and the Iron One wares of Western Iran are exactly the same. They're not. They're close in similarities in treatment. They're monochrome gray wares, and there are many parallels in shapes, but not all of the parallels are there. If we factor in the time difference between the two horizons, the differences can be seen perhaps as evolutionary. But as I said, sorry, and when I said that there's no evidence of the culture between Hisar and Hassanlu, that's again a little bit of an exaggeration, because that brings us to the whole Marlik hiccup. So we don't really have anything in the eastern part of the Caspian and then along the southern shores. But when we get to the southwestern part of the Caspian, we have this site of Marlik. It's this large mound that appears for the most part to be sort of a natural outcrop. Once again, as often the case, we had a flood of antiquities that sort of started to appear on the market, and it was traced back to this site. In 1961, you have an Iranian team who arrived at the site to take a look at it, and although they had really no idea what really sort of lay below the surface, once they started clearing it out, it quickly became apparent that Marlik was incredibly important and probably represented a royal cemetery of some forgotten kingdom. Scattered over the 53 tombs filled with an unbelievable variety of gold, silver, bronze, and pottery, which was of an incredibly high quality, and it really sort of testifies to the wealth and sophistication of this culture. Although the richest of these tombs were uncovered in the royal cemetery, basically the entire valley was essentially a contemporary burial ground for people of lesser importance as well. The tombs are basically shafts with walls of broken stone and mud mortar. In most of the tombs, you had the skeleton basically you didn't have the skeleton. It basically completely disintegrated by this point. But the few which were preserved showed an elaborate burial ritual. The body appeared to have been laid out carefully along a stone slab surrounded by all these precious objects. And so filled with, like objects including ritual vessels, human and animal figurines, jewelry, weapons, tools, small models of oxen and yokes and plows. Almost 1,000 fairly complete vessels were found in the tombs, all red, brown, and gray, very finely tempered, well fired, and looking a lot like our Iron One teapots. Now, the large collection of finds from Marlik have been dated to the very early part of the Iron One, possibly the late Bronze Age Iron One transition. The radiocarbon dates, the few that they have, seem to put them around 1475. So about the time that Iron One culture is supposed to begin. But the important thing to keep in mind is, okay, well, this is when the Iron One culture is supposed to begin, but clearly we have a fully developed and very elaborate culture at this point. And but actually probably the more important thing to keep in mind is that this is only the cemetery. We have not found any settlement. This is a royal cemetery, but the people who lived, who buried their dead in the cemetery, we have no bloody clue. They've done survey work in the area with the hope of trying to find some sort of settlement where these people lived, and if anything, they've just found more cemeteries, which have sort of pointed to the idea that maybe we're looking at a nomadic group, and this is just the cemetery of a nomadic group. So our big question is, does Marlik provide us with the gap between our Easternware gray culture of the late Bronze Age from the east and the Iron One culture in the west? And the answer is, unfortunately, we really can't be sure. It really doesn't give us a solid link. Artistically, the motifs found in the metalworking at Marlik show more parallels with either Mesopotamian culture or more specifically that of the Caucasus and even Anatolia. Now, new surveys in Azerbaijan have uncovered greater concentrations of early Western grayware culture there. So the Caucasus is looking like the more likely route rather than the east of the Caspian. And any connection between the East Iran and the West Iran are possibly, much ado about nothing. So obviously the problem of the start of the Iron One, the arrival of the Iranian speakers and the early Western greyware is a lot more complicated than we thought, and it's way more complicated than I'm presenting here. Believe it or not, this is the easy explanation for you. There's still the larger linguistic issue that has to be factored in, but we don't have time to go into it. So based on our present archaeological data, we really can't solve the issue. Systematic survey work has to be done first in and around Marlik to find any sort of associated settlement. Second, they really need to do more intensive surveys along the southern shores of the Caspian. Part of that is really difficult because you have the megalopolis of Tehran in the way. But yeah, there's just way too much work that needs to be done to try to link the stuff in the east, the Hisar culture, to the stuff on the west found in Marlik and Hassanlu. So speaking of Hassanlu, so it is in the Soldus Valley, just southwest of Lake Urmia. Now, the Hassanlu sequence produced a long-running sequence that provided evidence for a cultural break at the beginning of the period 5 levels, the ones that will eventually be dated to the Iron One. This cultural break is reflected in the architecture, in the ceramics, the burial practices, all which point to this is the result of an introduction of a new population into the Soldus Valley. So the association with our first Iranians and the Hassanlu 5 culture and our basic understanding of the Iron Age sequence of the Western Iran, for that matter, has proven to be more complex than suggested by Kyler Young's early works, and has changed to a certain degree over the past 45 years or so. But the sad part is, so often in archaeology, more questions than answers have emerged over time. And probably the site will eventually be revisited by excavators, but not anytime soon. So the story of the excavations, again, this is a great example of, how sometimes luck can totally change the story of an excavations. So they'd been doing survey work in the area the previous 2 years before, and Hassanlu was identified as the largest mound in the area, and it had some of this new pottery that people were talking about. So they decided that they would go and drop at least a couple of test trenches. And so you can see the 2 test trenches that they kind of did basically right down in the center of the mound. And basically it was like a 2 meter by 50, ended up being 50 meters or so, and basically Kyler was digging this thing by himself handful of workers, and they were just basically digging along for the better part of a month, and basically finding absolutely nothing. And so Dyson sort of showed up one day and said, okay, well, you got a little bit of mud brick there in the corner of your test trench. Follow that mud brick, and if it doesn't turn out to be anything, then we'll just move on to another site. So Kyler decided to continue the trench, follow the mud brick, and so sorry, it's the extent that it went. And it just turned out now that the corner of the mud brick was here. And as he followed the mud brick, it all emerged into this massive complex. Just the dumb luck of his trench was going right through the gateway into the middle of into the courtyard, into the citadel. If they had basically stopped a couple of days earlier before they had found the mud brick, they would have missed this site entirely. And at that, it was just basically this one little tiny corner that he hit that he then followed around and ended up in Berm Building 5. And you can see this massive complex that has emerged. So they found that entire complex, and they started digging down low. So what you end up having is this triple road system thingy here. This actually is probably level 3. It's probably Urartian. It's not even Iranian. This stuff will all belong to 4, and then they dug down and found basically the sequence of the earliest stuff. So the earliest level of our Iron 1 stuff is this level 5. Initially dated to around 1250, but once they got the more radiocarbon dates, they pushed it back to 1450. And so this was the one that was named the Early Western Greyware Horizon by Young, later changed to Iron 1 by Dyson. So characterized by this gray burnished ware in a number of new shapes, which was technologically and stylistically basically completely different from the earlier painted ceramics of Hassanlu level 6. And architecturally, you have the development of this, well, what they ended up calling a columned hall. So you have this rectangular structure. There'll be a central hearth, and then you will have 2 pillars, eventually become more pillars, but at least in this first version, you'll have 2 pillars. And then you'll have some sort of portico room that will lead into the main hall, and then sort of a storeroom on the side. And then you'll have a bench or dais along the back. Level 5 is destroyed, but a new but somewhat related culture emerges next. And that's the 4C, where we have our early Western, our late Western graywares. So the following period, 4C, this one probably dates closer to 1250-ish or 1050. Produced this related grayware ceramic culture called Late Western Gray by Young, Iron 2 by Dyson. There's a great deal of continuity in the ceramic traditions, as well as some rather significant developments. The late Western grayware ceramics have a wider distribution across Western Iran. We can find them as far south as Susa, but they're also found at Giyan and Tepe-Giyan and Tepe-Sialk. So it was believed by Young that the Iron 1 graywares of Hassanlu 5 represented the arrivals of the Iranians in the archaeological record. And because of the apparent cultural unity in the ceramic sequences between levels 5 to 3, basically they then went so far as to say that it was associated with the Medes of the Assyrian and Babylonian records. So Iron 1 seems to be the logical point to see the introduction of the Iranians into Iran. The same concepts of the same concept of the development can be said in regards to the architecture of level 4, which basically greatly expanded on the columned hall that we saw in level 5. Level 4 produced a series of these large column halls grouped around a central court. The structures are larger, but still produce a lot of the same characteristics seen in level 5, with the addition of a portico. or at least a more centralized portico. BB 2 and 3, yeah. So built burnt buildings 2 and building 3, the portico that you see out in the front, this actually seems to have been a later addition. It was something they built the main column tall first, and then they added on the portico afterwards. And then, yeah, over time, more sort of surrounding rooms were added to the buildings, probably for storage. There's also evidence of a second floor, at least over the side rooms. It's unclear whether the main hall had a second floor or there was just sort of a balcony that extended to those columns in the center. A balcony is probably more suggestive because, you know, you have this giant central hall in the main thing, and if you had a roof, or sorry, if you had a second floor that covered it already, that would greatly restrict the place for smoke to go, and you'd probably just smoke yourself out. So having a higher room, or only having a balcony around the sides means you'd have a high roof, and then, you know, basically you could have ventilation on the top of the roof to allow the smoke to get out. C was destroyed in a fire, but basically rebuilt along the same lines, and basically developed somewhat larger. This happened probably sometime around 1050. 4B also sees the introduction of a newware, what Young called the early Western buff. Many of the same shapes are there, just the main thing is the color is different. We start to find significant Assyrian material found in the excavations, which suggests that Hassanli was in the zone of interaction with the newly developing Assyrian Empire. And you can see, yeah, first of all, you've got more buildings, the courtyard becomes more complex. You have this very curious thing in front of burnt building 2, which is, whether we want to call it an altar or something like that, but you've got this platform that you see here, a mud brick platform with steps up. Then there's this sort of standing stone, and then there's this, you know, sort of weirdly shaped blackish blue, very polished stone that sat in front of the pillar itself. You know, everything's, you know, clearly very symbolic. You know, we don't know what the hell this is, and usually if we don't know what it is, we want to claim that it's cultic or religious in nature. This one probably falls under that category. As much as I really want to fight against that, it's weird. So you can see the main central hearth, if you will, in the center, and then these are the column bases. So you would have a mud brick column base, and the wooden column base would have stuck upright. This is just some sort of circular bin. What are we looking at in that one? Again, that's just another one of the rooms. So you can see the central hearth and the giant mud brick column bases. Oh yeah, and in the back you can see sort of the raised dais or a seat or something like that at the back. Some people have want to suggest that maybe these things are temples. I think you get going a little overboard, although again, in these early periods, it's often hard to sort of separate the cultic from the domestic when it comes to structures. Here you're looking at sort of the entrance into the courtyard. You can see actually once they sort of dug down, they could see that the courtyard was actually caved and very well. There's actually even a set of staircases that they somehow missed. You can see that they had to go down at least fairly deep to get to those levels. So you can understand why they would have missed it in the step trenches. And yeah, you can see the front of burn building 3, and you can see the sort of the elaborate facade for its entrance. So although made of mud brick, these things were very elaborately done. We're dealing with sort of a complex society that was doing these things. So like I said, 4B ended in a violent destruction. It was initially attributed to the Assyrians, but now actually the people who are working on the publications of Hassanli want to say it actually belongs to the Urartians. The following level 3, which is dated to sometime around 800, has always been sort of a problematic one, especially stratigraphically. But 4B had over 150 bodies found in the excavations. Many of them sort of slaughtered in situ and sometimes even heavily mutilated. There were 70 bodies found in Burnt Building 2 alone. You can see, so you've got like an empty quiver that was found on one of the steps. So somebody was like defending, firing off their arrows. They ran out of arrows, just threw their quiver down and kept running. And here you have others who are basically slaughtered on the steps, shot in the back with arrows, and as they sort of ran up the steps to get into Burnt Building 2. It was an incredibly grisly end to the site. Others were sort of found grouped together like it was sort of a mass execution. And then, of course, there is perhaps the more famous picture that maybe you guys have seen before. I think they actually have a painting of it in the grad student lounge or something like that, what are affectionately known as the Hassanlu lovers. What you have is a male and female skeleton. They were actually found in one of the side rooms of Burnt Building 2. And the basic reconstruction we have is that these guys were trapped in the building and they were basically succumbing to the fumes, and they sort of fell down together in each other's arms. And then with the last bit of energy that the woman had, she sort of lifted her hand up and basically was caressing her husband or her mate's face, and she died in that position. So it was quite an incredible sight when they sort of cleared it all off. Always kind of a stunning photo, I always thought, but learn from Steve's mistakes. It doesn't make for a good wedding present. So one of the more exciting finds in the excavations were what is something that was known as the Gold Bowl. Here you see Dyson sort of holding up the bowl in triumph, if you will. And this photo, of course, makes every conservator cringe. This is not the way you deal with an important find like this. So you're looking at basically a solid, well, a gold sheet bowl that is got hammered decoration, like an époussé decoration on it. And it was actually found in the hands of like a skeleton. Again, the reconstruction we have is that he was on the second floor of the balcony or in the second floor over the storerooms in the fire, basically looting the building, and the floor collapsed out from underneath him, and then he fell down into the first floor and then gets crushed by the rest of the roofing timbers that fell down on top of him. So he basically had this gold bowl in the clutches of a skeleton when they excavated it. So you can see the imagery that is found on the gold bowl. And there's no end to discussion as to what exactly it's supposed to represent, whether it represents a particular myth or it's a couple of myths mixed together. People have been basically trying for years to decipher and try to decide what culture the artwork basically belonged to. I think most people sort of point to sort of stuff from the Caucasus. Yeah, so here you can see, this is just sort of a drawing, a schematic drawing of one of the side rooms. And so there is the gold bowl in the hands of some jackass looter, and you had a couple of other people with a mace and a sword. All these guys basically fell from the second floor, is what we understand, into a side room of Burnt Building 2. After this destruction, though, once we start to move out of this, we start to have a new ceramic, well, our early Western buffware, our Iron 3, as Dyson called it. So it's this buff ceramic that owes a lot of relation to the stuff we saw in levels, well, in Iron 1 and Iron 2, or early Western Gray, late Western Gray. Related wares can be found from Zawiya in Luristan, so to the south. And level 3 also produced a painted ceramic, often with these sort of triangular designs. And most people, and particularly Dyson, want to link these Iron 3 ceramics to the historical Medes of the Assyrian records. So in a simplified manner, as simplified as that actually sounded, believe it or not, that was, this was sort of our state of understanding of Western Iranian archaeology, more or less by 1967. Now, the Syrian records make mention of a state called Parsua, particularly in the records of Shalmaneser III, so 859 to 824. Now, everybody, of course, wants to link Parsua to the state that will eventually develop into the Persians. Parsua, Persians, kind of makes sense. Now, Parsua is placed somewhere in the northwest in the Zagros Mountains, but then later records indicate that the state of Parsua moved and it was located south, more in Elamite territory. And later still, traditions have Parsua, further sort of south into Fars, what traditionally is the homeland of the Persians. Fars comes from Parsua. So we seem to have this migrating state of Parsua, which was hoped to be linked to the southward movement of our gray and buffed ware ceramics. And excuse me, as excavations continued, the picture unfortunately became a great deal less clear. What we can say, though, is that many of the forms of the later Persian culture can be seen in the Iron Age record, the earlier Iron Age record. We see major settlements with fortified citadels, all containing these columned halls, what will eventually become known as manor houses. Later equivalents of Khan or tribal leaders that could easily be seen as developments of the columned halls that we saw at Hasanlu. The first one is seen at the site of Nushijan, and then Nushijan here on the bottom right. On the left, you have Babajan, and then Godin will be the other important site for it. This is actually from the excavations of Godin, where the preservation wasn't as good, but you could, as good as Hasanlu, I can say, but you at least have the same sort of, see the outline of the walls in the background, and all the people are standing on the column bases to give you a feel for what the columned hall would have looked like. And so what you have with these manor houses, it's the columned halls from Hasanlu, they've just become a lot larger. And then once we get into the Persian period, the column halls get even larger than that. Other sort of important developments in these citadels where the manor houses are, you can see important defensive techniques that are starting to emerge, where you have these things that are often known as arrow loops. You often see these in medieval castles, those little narrow slits that if you look on from the inside, they've got sort of a triangular interior, and it comes down to a narrow point. The idea is that that's for somebody with an arrow, with a bow and arrow, they can basically hit from a wider angle, but then they can't be, and they're firing through a narrow slit. So people attacking, shooting arrows at them, it's harder for the attackers to hit the defenders. And this is actually one of the earliest examples of it. At Babajan, we also have the introduction of what might be one of the first fire temples, which will become well known in Persian times for the Zoroastrian religion. You can see this incredibly well preserved sort of tower-like structure, and then the central hearth that sort of sat in the base of it, that where the holy fire would have been kept. So this was our messed up state of Iranian archaeology by 1967. The arrival of the Iranians came into Iran sometime around 1450, and this probably represents the Medes who bring an end to the Assyrians, since this is traditionally where they kind of lived. How does this, of course, relate to the Persians? Now, the background of the Persians is something that's still argued about. The Persians are not attested in Near Eastern records before the first millennium. We have no idea about the development of the Persian state in Fars until about the 7th century BC. Fars is geographically the area that will eventually become the center of the Persian kingdom. Had always been part of the earlier kingdom of Anshan and Elam, which we encountered when we looked at the Old and Middle Elamite pyramid. After about the 12th century, Anshan seems to go into some decline, and between 1700, there's basically no real evidence of anybody living in the area. So we're sort of at a loss to understand how we're to see the Persians moving into Fars, consolidating this empire when we have very little evidence of anybody actually living in Fars at the time that they're supposed to be doing this. What we've come to believe, and I will tell you it's really quite shaky, is the idea that the West Iranian Persians were, for the most part, nomadic. And they populate Fars in nomadic camps, which are, of course, difficult to document archaeologically. In 646, Ashurbanipal raids Susa, the Elamite polity, which had basically already been in decline since 612. They lost control over Anshan and basically leaving a vacuum, if you will, for someone else to take over. And that's what our nomadic Persian people did. And so this newly formed sort of detached polity, if you will, forms itself into this independent political unit or entity that is ruled by a Persian family. So the idea is that Anshan would be directly related to the rise of the Persian state. And the idea is actually backed up somewhat through a chance archaeological discovery, which seems to actually call the early Persian state Anshan. The find is this thing called the Cyrus cylinder. It was found in Babylon and calls Cyrus, King Cyrus, the great king who captured Babylon, and all his predecessors, Cambyses I, Cyrus the first, Thespes, kings of Anshan. As well, there's some tablets that were found in Persepolis, one of the Persian capitals, is labeled as belonging to Cyrus the Anshanite. So the founder of the Persian Empire was Cyrus the Great. We know from the Cyrus cylinder that he was descended from a line of local kings who governed a small kingdom called Parsawa for 3 generations, beginning with a man called Thespis. According to later Greek sources, Parsawa was originally a vassal state of the Median Empire. The precise boundaries of Parsawa in this early period is really not certain. There's little evidence to suggest a small principality in Fars in the late 7th and 6th century, which might be what Cyrus's predecessors had built on. Another small kingdom seems to have evolved at Susa, judging from the large list of Persian names which appear on a tablet from about the same time. The Cyrus cylinder again says that Cyrus restored the sanctuaries at Susa and Dare, suggesting that he had conquered Susa before he made his campaigns into Babylon. So the big question is, how did Cyrus come to power? Records say that Cyrus took over the Median Empire after he married the daughter of the Median king Astyages, and then there was some sort of coup. The records say that Astyages raised a huge army against Cyrus to basically take him out because he was becoming a little too popular. But when the army found out that they were going against Cyrus, they rebelled against Astyages and put Cyrus in charge. If we're to take this at face value, we could say that the reason for Astyages' attack was probably to check the growing Persian power, if you will, as Cyrus began taking over more and more territory in the south, and the Medes were getting a little nervous about what his ambitions might have been. But this is reading tea leaves, if you will. With the takeover of the Medes by Cyrus, he moved north into Anatolia and proceeded to do what the Medes could not do, which is take over Lydia, and then all of the Greek colonies on the west coast. The dating for this is kind of wonky, somewhere around 540. Now, with the Persians taking over the Median Empire, this eliminated the Babylon's allies and brought the Persians and the Babylonians face to face. We really don't know how much contact there was, but we do believe that after the conquest of Lydia, there were small skirmishes between the Babylonians and the Persians. So Cyrus's invasion of Babylon seems to be more of a culmination of long-term hostilities than sort of any sort of secret invasion, as it's often sort of portrayed. And the key thing is that his invasion wasn't unchallenged. The Babylonian and Persian armies met near the city of Opis, where the Babylonians basically ran away. Opis was looted, the people were slaughtered. After that, Sippar surrendered. And then we see one of the weirdest stories in Near Eastern history, if you will. I talked about this last class, but the king at the time was Nabonidus, who was often seen as this sort of weird king who no one in Babylon was very fond of. The way the story goes is after being gone for Babylon for close to 7 years, he arrived just in time for that Akitu, the Babylonian New Year's festival, which was a huge party. Everybody was drinking heavily, including the city guards. And somehow no one saw the approaching Persian army, who essentially marched into the center of a drunk and hungover city with zero resistance. Or at least that's how it's often sort of described. It probably wasn't a matter of walking in on a bunch of drunk Babylonians. And, it must be remembered that we saw in the textual data that the Chaldeans, especially Nabonidus himself, were not the most loved individuals in Babylon. It's more probable to see that the Babylonian populace received the Persian conquest almost as sort of a savior from these unliked rulers, if you will. Whatever the truth, the Babylonian Empire comes to a rather undramatic and rather embarrassing end. After the conquest of Babylon, Cyrus turns his attention east and campaigns in eastern Iran and Central Asia, where he apparently died in battle in 530. Now, one of the direct results of Cyrus's conquest was the full development of the Persian homeland. And with that, he founds a new royal center about 75 kilometers northwest of Anshan, which he named after his tribe, Pasargadae, which we'll look at in a little bit. Now, when you look at it, Cyrus's achievements were really quite impressive. In less than 30 years, he brought a vast amount of territory under control of a single kingdom, which in the beginning had been really quite tiny. Like he ended up conquering a territory that was larger than the Assyrians managed to do, and did it very quickly, with a lot less history behind it. So looking at Pasargadae, Cyrus's royal city. Now, this is the thing to keep in mind, is it was a royal city, not a capital per se. It really is kind of a weird site. So it's located on the Morghab Plain in southwestern Iran. According to the Greek historian Strabo, this is the site of Cyrus's earlier defeat over Astyages of the Medes. The Persian name for the site, Pasargadae, is this weird Greek name, which is just our town of the Persians. The actual Persian name was Batrakatash. And the key thing about Pasargadae is that this is where early Achaemenid art and architecture really sort of develops. The site is dominated by the tomb of Cyrus. The early name for the tomb, when people started actually visiting to excavate the tomb, the local name for the place was Takhti Suleiman, the tomb of the mother of Solomon. But we've come to understand that this was the tomb of Cyrus. Initially, there was an inscription that apparently said, "Passerby, I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians an empire and was the king of Asia. Grudge me not, therefore, this simple monument." So the tomb itself sits on the south end of the site, so about a kilometer south of the quote-unquote palaces. And it's a synthesis of many Near Eastern elements. So ashlar masonry, that really is kind of an Aegean and an Anatolian thing. Plain smooth surfaces, few decorative moldings, really sort of leaves this impression of dignity and simplicity and strength. It reached a height of about 11 meters. And according to the historical records, until the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus's body sat there on a gold couch with just a small offering table. Now, the site itself of Pasargadae covers an area of about 3 by 2 kilometers. It's really this kind of large park-like environment next to the Pulvar River. You have this monumental gatehouse, 2 palaces, royal gardens, this enigmatic tower known as the Zendan, and then this other sort of thing that has a platform and two stone plinths on it, which is known as the Talitak. Now, the palaces are a mix of traditional Persian architectures or are columned hall, but in this case, they become much larger. So these lofty columned halls with Ionian Greek style. This is sort of the first use of one of the more distinctive Achaemenid architectural concepts, the capital in the form of a double animal proto, which I will get to a photo in a bit. But like, this is basically the site. You have these pavilions and palaces, this park-like environment, and then the irrigation system to make sure that the park itself is watered, well watered. So the Zindan de Suleiman. So it's this weird solitary tower. Translation is the prison of Solomon. Obviously has nothing to do with that whatsoever, but this is just, what happens. The locals will create their own sort of folklore, and when the first European visitors come, they ask what this thing is called, and that's what they report down. Now, whatever this tower is, it was later copied by the later Persian king Darius at the site of Naksh-i-Rustam, which we'll look at in a bit. It's basically a singular tower, sorry, a 14-meter high tower with a single sort of solitary room. It could be a tomb, but there's no evidence of a couch or in the inscription or anything to suggest that anybody would have been put in there. It's more probable that it was another one of these Zoroastrian fire temples, similar to what we saw at Nushijan. The only problem being is that we don't have any sort of sooting stains on the interior that would suggest that a fire was there. But nothing else really kind of makes sense. The stone plinth, yep.
The Zendan was built by Darius II?
No, there's a copy like at another site, Naksh-i-Rustam, which we'll look at in a little bit. Darius made a copy of this thing and built it there too. Same thing with the following thing here. So you have the stone plinths. It's found at the northern limit of the site. Basically, you have this flattened out platform, if you will. Then you have these two stone plinths. They're about 2 meters in height. Not entirely sure what they were used for, but the idea is that the king would have ascended the top via the 8 steps. And then you had, or at least one of them, the king would have stood on top. The other one was an altar of some kind. There's actually drawings from Naksh-i-Rustam or a carving from Naksh-i-Rustam, which seems to, it might be what we're looking at here, because you see the king standing on a stone plinth, and then the other side you have another sort of altar that would have had the fire on it as well. And then you can see Ahura Mazda, the Persian god, sort of sitting in the middle of it. So it's known as the Tali Takht. It was unfinished at Cyrus's death. Was to be used as some sort of terrace, reused by Darius as some sort of citadel with mud brick defenses. There is evidence of this structure being burnt, and the dating for the destruction seems to be around 300, which is sort of suggestive that this was done by Alexander the Great, maybe. Moving on to Persepolis. So you had 2 main excavators who were at Persepolis. The first one was Ernest Hertzfeld. And he's the first one who really sort of started all the investigations at Persepolis itself between 1931 and 34. And then 34, it's overtaken by Heinrich Schmidt, who was sort of his apprentice, if you will. And this is where the first sort of real investigations of the Persian capital emerged. So Persepolis was a city that was started by Darius the Great in about 518. But he started it, and then you basically have every king sort of adding renovations to it, whatever. A great deal of it was done by Artaxerxes the First. Now, it was sort of set up to be the one of the main seats of government. But the thing to keep in mind is that the way that the Persian court worked is that they didn't really have a singular capital city. They had a series of capitals. You had Pasargadae, which was kind of like the summer capital. You had Persepolis, Susa, and then eventually Babylon itself. And what you had was the court moved like a bunch of nomads around the landscape, visiting all of these different sites at different times. But Persepolis seemed to be the one that was at least decided to be the most permanent, if you will. So it's seat of government. We have a lot of records. We're still trying to get through the records that were found in the excavations of Persepolis. But then there's all these reception halls and festival halls for the Assyrian kings where they would have brought in people from all over the empire. Now, Darius died before it was finished, but then, like I said, it was basically construction continued at the site by basically everybody that follows. So the ancient name of the site was actually Parsa, and Persepolis is Parsapolis, Greeks or Persian city, if you will, by the Greeks. So according to the tablets that were inscribed in Old Persian Elamite that were found there, it seems that Darius planned this to be an impressive complex of palaces, and not only to be sort of the seat of one of the seats of government, but also to be as sort of a showplace and a spectacular sort of center for the reception and festivals of the Achaemenid kings through their empire. Darius lived long enough to see only a small part of his plans executed. His brilliant and grandiose ideas were taken up by and followed by his son and successor Xerxes, who, according to an excavation foundation inscription found, that said, "When my father Darius went away from the throne, I, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, became king on my father's throne. After I became king, what had been done by my father, I also did, and other works I added." Most of what we know of Persepolis probably is the work of Xerxes. But like I said, later kings would each sort of add their own sort of palaces and whatnot. Now, what was excavated, of course, in fine fashion, was the royal Acropolis of the city. And as far as we know, the surrounding lower city, which is immense, basically stretching close to almost 5 kilometers to the royal necropolis of Nakshir-Rustam. It's never really been investigated. Kyler would say that if you walked basically between Persepolis and Nakshir-Rustam, you basically find the entire 5 kilometers littered with Persian pottery for the entire stretch. The Acropolis is this lofty architectural stone terrace that was about 450 by 350 meters, round right up against the face of the Kuhi Ramat. And this is where all the palaces and administrative structures are found. And basically what you're looking at is a citadel that's covered in our columned halls that we can trace all the way back to Hassanlu 5. The platform, people gained access to the platform by a 14-meter high double stairway. They had wide steps that were designed for horses to walk up, which would then lead you up to the gate of Xerxes. So yeah, there's your gate of Xerxes, and there's the massive staircase that would lead you up. So at the north of the Apadana stands the impressive gate of Xerxes, to which you have this broad staircase. Xerxes, who built the structure, named it the Gate of All Nations. And it was for all visitors had to basically pass through this gateway to get to. It was the only entrance to the citadel, or to the terrace, sorry. And it would be the main route to go to the throne hall, where which, sorry, I should say, you would pay homage to the king. Now, the gate consisted of one sort of spacious room whose roof was supported by 4 stone columns with bell-shaped bases. Do I have the photo? Yeah, there's the bell-shaped base. Parallels to the inner walls of this room parallel to the inner walls of the room ran a stone bench interrupted by the doorways. The exterior walls of the structure were made of thick mud brick and were decorated with numerous niches. Each of the 3 walls on the east, west, and south had a very large stone doorway, and a pair of colossal bulls guarded the western entrance. Two Assyrianized man bulls stood at the eastern doorway. Engraved above each of the 4 colossi is a trilingual inscription attested to Xerxes having built and completed the gate. The doorway to the south opened up towards the Apadana, and that's the wider one of the 3. So just more shots of what it looked like in 1930s when they were doing the excavations, and this is a giant belled base of the column. And then up on top, you can start to see, I talked about these double animal protom column bases, which you'll get a better view of later on. But yeah, we'll come back to that. So by far, the largest and most sort of spectacular building is the Apadana. It's, roughly square in shape, each side being 110 meters long. It was begun by Darius, finished by Xerxes, and was used mainly for great receptions by the kings. When they were excavating there in the 30s, 13 of its 72 columns still stood on this enormous platform. Then you had 2 monumental staircases on the north and the east that gave access to the building. The staircases are adorned with rows of beautifully executed relief showing scenes from the New Year's festival, and also processions of representatives of 23 subject nations of the Achaemenid Empire, with court nobles and Persians and Medes, followed by soldiers and guards, their horses and royal chariots. All the delegates are portrayed, I guess, in their native attire. Some completely in Persian style, carrying gifts as tokens of their loyalties to the king. These gifts often include silver and gold vessels or vases, weapons, woven fabrics, jewelries, animals. A lot of these things are sort of unique to the individual countries that the delegates are coming from. The overall arrangement seems pretty repetitive. There are some marked differences, particularly in the designs of the clothing that they wear, the hair or headdresses, hairstyles, the beards and beard styles, and even the shoes. Each one sort of gives each delegation its own distinctive character and makes them, easy to sort of pick out. The interior room is almost 20 meters high and 60 meters on each side. And then you have porticos on each side after that. Then you have also storerooms on every corner. Now, this is just photos of the staircase leading up. Some more detailed photos. I should probably blow that up a little bit more, but here you can see people coming. These are supposed to be Nabateans, so coming from Arabia, leading their camels up to the Persian king. Here, this is what Ethiopian delegation from the Red Sea. This one, Persian guards, as you can see, standing on the inner flight of the stairs. Oh, yes, and this important image that you see on the northern staircase, which shows a bull being attacked by a lion. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So 12 columns supported the roof of the central hall, which 3 small stairways descended. Reliefs on these stairways depict servants coming up from up the steps carrying animals and food, covered dishes, all to be served at the king's table. On the eastern and western door jambs are reliefs showing the king in formal dress leaving the palace, followed by 2 attendants. And then, yeah, the reliefs on the northern and southern doorways depict the king in combat with monsters. So yeah, the scene here that I talked about earlier, each one flanked, you have a bull being attacked by a lion, and this is basically seen as one great power overpowering another great power, which is exactly how the Persians saw their empire. And especially in this case here, it's the Persian lion overtaking the Babylonian bull. And this is obviously done to sort of impress visitors, if you will. Foundation tablets of gold and silver were found in 2 deposit boxes in the foundation of the palace. They contain an inscription by Darius written in Old Persian cuneiform, which describes the extent of his empire in broad geographic terms. You can see it there in the original stone box that it was laid into. So yeah, one of the plates was in gold, the other one was in and another one was in silver. They all had sort of the same sort of trilingual inscription. Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries, son of Hystaspes and Achaemenid king. King Darius says, "This kingdom which I hold from the Sake, who are beyond Sogdia to Kush, and from Sind," basically describing the widest extent possible. So behind the Apadana, you have the smaller palace, the Palace of Darius I. It's basically you have southeast of the Apadana on its own separate sort of platform. And it will be sort of the plan that all other palaces built by later kings will sort of follow, if you will. Xerxes' palace is twice as large as Darius's. Shows very similar decorative techniques on its stone door frames and windows, except for 2 large inscriptions written by Xerxes on the eastern and western doorways. Instead of showing the king's combat with monsters, these doorways depict servants with ibexes. Unfortunately, all of these reliefs of this palace are less well preserved than those of Darius's palace. The large central building, if you will, is known as the harem, where the royal ladies lived. Was constructed in this sort of L-shaped form. The main wing was oriented roughly north-south, and the west wing extended westwards from the southern portion of the main wing. The name harem it's generally called the harem, but it should probably better be called the Queen's Palace. It should be stressed that Achaemenid harems never existed and are in fact an invention by Western scholars. Europeans knew about the harem of the Ottoman Sultan, read about the polygamous Persians, and therefore projected a lot of their own ideas on the ancient Near Eastern state. Stories about the great king's 360 wives are nothing really more than Greek sexual fantasies, really. From the Persepolis fortification tablets, that gold and silver tablets that we saw earlier, we learned that Darius had maybe 4 wives, not 360. So the main nucleus of the wing was this large centrally placed columned hall with a portico facing a spacious courtyard. The hall had 4 doorways whose jambs were decorated with reliefs, and the reliefs on the western doorway show the king in combat with a lion. The queen's quarters themselves are not entirely known, but this impressive central section was probably reserved for her and her retinue. The building was heavily reconstructed in the 1930s by the University of Chicago team, and it served as their actual excavation house while they were there. But now it's been turned into more of a visitor center museum at the site. There are some foundation deposits that were found in the corners of the buildings. Again, gold plates with inscriptions by Xerxes. So this is sort of showing you the interior with the reconstruction by Chicago, and you can see all the pottery that was coming out of the excavations itself. The main wing had 6 apartments arranged in 2 rows. Each apartment consisted of a large pillared room and one or sometimes 2 small rooms adjacent to them. The west wing contained 16 additional apartments that were all sort of laid out in a similar fashion. The Tropylion, or the council hall, is situated between the royal apartments and the throne room. You actually gain access to the royal apartments by means of a really nice staircase that you're seeing here, which led to the 3 entrances. 2 were for official purposes. The 3rd was a secret doorway that led into the Queen's Palace, or harem. The main facade was covered with depictions of Persian guards and the now all too familiar scene of the lion attacking a bull. Persians had a little obsession about this image. When you consider how easily supposedly they defeated the Persians, it's kind of ironic, but what can you do? On the jambs of the southern doorway, you have an image of Xerxes depicted entering the Great Hall. Here you can see him there. The 3 gates that you have are decorated. In the eastern gate, we can see the king sitting on his throne, attended by the crown prince. The southern and northern gates show the king followed by 2 attendants. One is carrying a little fly whisk. The other is holding a parasol over the king's head. On the jamb of the eastern doorway, there's a relief of Xerxes fighting a lion-headed monster. So this is these capital columns I keep referring to. So the council building had some of the best examples preserved of Persian capitals, so the tops of a column that were beautifully carved to look like 2 bulls basically lying sitting back to back. These double animal protomes, so you basically have the 2 animals sitting there, and the cross beam for the roof would have lay on their back. There's standards in Persian architecture. The animal itself might be different, but overall, this double animal protome is a real standard in Persian architecture. We find them all over the empire. There's a great example. If you go to the University of Chicago, go to the museum there, and you can see this actually exact one. They also have another one of 2 bulls that they brought back from their exhibitions that's sitting in the museum. There's also a good example of a bull one from the Tbilisi National Museum in Georgia, from a smaller palace that was found in Georgia. Oh yeah, here we have an example of one that was 2 griffins. So the throne hall next to the Apadana. This is the 2nd largest building on the terrace, and it's often called the 100-columned hall. It was started by Xerxes, probably completed by Artaxerxes at the end of the 5th century. It was not as tall or large as the Apadana. It was only 68.5 meters on each side. It had 8 stone doorways that were decorated on the south and north, with release of throne scenes on the east and western side. The king is depicted in combat with monsters. Here you see him again. In addition, the northern portico of the building is flanked by 2 colossal stoned bulls. At the beginning of Xerxes' reign, the throne hall was used mainly for receptions for representatives of all the subject nations of his empire. Later, when the treasury, which is situated behind it, was constructed, and well, actually, sorry, it had been constructed earlier, but when the treasury became too small for all the riches of Persia, the throne hall also served as a storehouse and well, basically a place to display all the fine objects of tribute and booty objects of the royal treasury. Yeah, this is the double proton bulls that you can see in the OI Museum now, and there's also one in the British Museum too. So behind the throne hall is the treasury. It's adjacent to the harem. It was the treasury, but also served as sort of the armory and the royal storehouse of the Achaemenid kings. The tremendous wealth stored here comes from the booty of the conquered nations, and as well the annual tribute sent by the peoples of the empire to the king, usually for the New Year's festival. So before the throne hall was finished, the most spacious room of the treasury was used as the reception hall. Many people were employed to keep the gold and silver shining. And from the fortification tablets that we have, it's known that in 467, no less than 1,348 people were employed in the treasury just to take care of all the goodies. The treasury was sort of rebuilt and expanded several times, but eventually became too small for all the stuff coming into the kingdom. Several weights were found there as well, large, heavy blocks of diorite with inscriptions, and basically showing weight systems from all over the empire. And I guess this is a way of them being able to track what goods were coming in from the different areas. You can see some of the weights here. They are 160 karsha, sorry, 120 and 60 karsha, which is the name of the weight. And the inscriptions that are on them mention King Darius. Oh, and statue on the left. Never mind. Oh yeah, sorry, this is still the treasury. So we have two stone reliefs that were decorated, which sort of attest to the function of the building. You see Darius seated on his throne, being approached by a high dignitary whose hand is raised to his mouth as a gesture of respective greeting. Behind the king stands the crown prince Xerxes, who's followed by attendants or court officials, and the visitor is giving gifts to the king. All right, so we're going to finish off very quickly looking at the site of Nakshi Rustam. So it's a site located north of Persepolis and basically carved into the cliff face. You have 4 tombs of the Achaemenid period, and then another one of these sort of stone towers similar to what you saw at Pasargadae. So the tombs are tunneled directly into the cliff face in slightly different plans. The oldest tomb is dated to Darius I. The others, well, we're not entirely sure which king exactly to attribute them to. So the facade of tomb 1 of Darius is carved up 15 meters from the surface, and has a total height of almost 23 meters. Now you have 3 registers. The bottom one is blank. You can see the bottom one. Then the middle one is basically made to represent and that's the entrance to the tomb itself, is made to represent the entrance to one of the palace buildings or the columned halls. And then the top shows Darius worshipping at a structure similar to what we saw at Pasargadae. The palace facade with columns and capitals has also a trilingual inscription sort of carved in between them. And actually, sorry, the top scene too, the scene of Darius standing in front of, or standing on that little stone plinth with the fire across from him, has basically has the plinth being held up by 30 representatives of people of the empire. Oops. This facade will be basically copied by later kings uh, uh, in, well, at Nakshirostam. Unfortunately, nothing was found in the tombs when they actually got to them. The Kabaye Zarosht, or just more affectionately known as the Kaaba, is another one of these weird towers. It's 46 meters high. Oh, sorry, it's 46 meters from the mountain, and sits directly opposite what we believe to be Darius II's tomb. Again, it's a rectangular structure, has only one entrance door. It's made of white limestone. It's about 12 meters high, much better than 46. Includes sort of a set of sort of triple staircase on each side of its base, each of them about 7 meters long. The entrance door leads to a chamber inside via sort of a 30-stair stone staircase. So this seems to be a copy essentially of the Zendani Soliman. And again, you know, our best guess is that it's one of these fire temples, going back all the way to Baba Jan. So the fire temples are important in Zoroastrian religion, the main religion of the Iranians. It's this, for those of you, if you've never even heard of the Zoroastrian religion, probably not too much of a surprise, although it's still around today. It's a dualistic religion, basically good versus evil. Ahura Mazda being the good god, and Angra Mainyu is the bad god. Now, the fire temples themselves, this is a place where the sacred fire would be kept burning. It's one that it's a fire that's well, in examples of where the fire temples are still done today, in theory, these fires have been burning for hundreds of years. It's the problem we have with saying that these towers are fire temples is that there are no windows. You can see all these false windows there, but they do not actually let air in. So it's a little bit on the airtight side, so bad for flames. Also, the fact that we don't have the blackening from soot on the inside would suggest that, again, probably not, or well, makes it difficult to believe that there was a flame that was held in there. You know, it could be a mausoleum of some kind, but we just don't know. It does bear a resemblance. Okay, so this is a much later fire temple, but from later fire temples we know from that have been found elsewhere, they do seem to at least bear resemblance to them. Maybe it was just a smaller, like a oil lamp or something that was kept burning as opposed to a giant roaring flame. But even that would have left some sort of sooting. It's a big question. We still don't really have a good answer as to what these things are. So the site of Persepolis really is amazing. Truly one of the most wondrous sites in the world that can be visited today. And you still sort of get a good feel for how the city itself looked. But you have to keep in mind, you know, similar to the issue that we have with Boğazköy, this large section, the place with all the palaces, the column halls, this is only the Acropolis. The city where thousands of people lived runs for kilometers towards Nakşirustam, like I said, almost 5 kilometers. Like if we ever really sort of get back to being able to do some serious work in Iran and get permission to work at this site, you know, remote sensing work to map out this lower town would be a key piece of work that we need to do, coupled with a little excavation. Now, it could very well be that we might not find much in the way of architectural remains from that area of the lower town, because it is possible, based on, you know, some of the textual data that we have, because that royal court moved around so much, the idea is that much of the lower town was basically people living in tents in a nomadic lifestyle. It's possible. I doubt that. I think if we actually get around to getting some work done there, it'll actually change so much of our understandings, especially our understandings of the Persian Empire. But Fortunately, that is the way the political situation is going on. It is not going to happen probably in my lifetime. So Achaemenid sites tend to produce little in the way of small finds. Why? Maybe they were looted. We don't really know. Little is known aside from ceramic of the material culture of the everyday Joe Persian. The vessels tend to be generally plain, emphasis on crisp shapes that probably come from metal prototypes, basically copying metal vessels shapes in clay. No. The other problem, yeah, so the neglect of our sort of historical understanding of the Persians, like or at least contemporary records of the Persians, is kind of the result of the very nature of the Achaemenid dynasty. They did not really record their own history of their empire, and this is why we built a lot of our understandings on the Greek sources, which are obviously going to be a little biased. Apart from a few accidental inscriptions, the most prominent being the Bisatun inscription, there's no Persian narrative at all of their accomplishments. Almost everything we know about Persia comes from the surviving texts written by enemies or subject peoples of the empire, or people they came into conflict with, predominantly the Greeks, which is why they are often sort of portrayed in a much nastier light. However, the Achaemenids were tenacious bookkeepers. Even though they didn't write histories about themselves, they were incredible bookkeepers. And it's through this behavior that we get a good understanding of the workings of the empire itself. The excavated tablets that we have from the Achaemenid era show a fascination with recording transactions, who paid how much for what, but not a tendency to preserve the chronicles of the development of the Achaemenid rule over its vast territories. Really, research into Achaemenid Persia has so far really revealed more mysteries than any answers. For starters, the sudden appearance of the empire under its founding father, Cyrus the Great, is still something that has yet to be really sort of explained. Cyrus, whose roots and genealogy are still subject of debate, became a ruler of what was allegedly an alliance of Persian nomadic tribes in 559. But by 539, already rightfully claimed to be king of the world. On top of that, there wasn't really an equivalent of the modern word empire in the ancient Persian language. Our Greek sources talk about the power of the great kings of the Achaemenid, the Greeks inscriptions talk about the power of the great kings, and the Achaemenid inscriptions talk about those countries and kings that were obedient to the great king. However, it's difficult to grasp through our modern perception. We're facing an empire without any real sort of definitive boundary. And it's probably better to think of the Achaemenid Persia as the way they seem to, as sort of this diverse collection of races and subjects living under the sway of the great kings of Persia, rather than sort of a territorial nation state whose primary interest was to defend its frontiers, like what we saw with the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Yeah, sorry, that's just all that there. Am I doing time-wise? What we can say is that the Persians were a little egocentric in the way they looked at their empire. First, kingship is firmly rooted in Persia, or more precisely, Parsua. As well, there is the Aryan ethnic and cultural community, and it requires the descendants from the family of Achaemenes, who is sort of the founding king of all of these guys. The Persians, at the same time, stand out as a people on account of their ethnicity. That is, the Persian people under the king. The further away you got from Persia, the less important you were in the empire. So the Medes, you had the king, then you had the people of Persia, then you had the Medes, and then you start having the Phrygians, the Lydians, and so on. So Persian kingship also differs from its predecessors because it really, more so than the others, it acknowledged the foreign kings, but put the Persian power above them, where the king was referred to as the king of kings, thanks to the fact that thanks to the fact that all these lands sort of acknowledge the rule of the Persian king as being superior to theirs. Secondly, Persian kingship is characterized by a special sort of relationship between the ruler and the gods. Though the king was not sort of a god, there wasn't this sort of divine descent like we saw with previous empires. They did have godlike qualities. Ahura Mazda and the other gods that are bestowed on the kingdom these gods bestowed the kingdom on Darius or Xerxes by the favor of Ahura Mazda. He was basically elected and installed by the Persian gods. Thirdly, kingship owes itself to the favor of Ahura Mazda, and the king is obliged to protect the god's good creation. And he's capable of doing so because the god has given him the abilities to tell right from wrong. And it's because he has these special qualities that it's conducive to promote justice and protection of order, and it's done so by gifts of the gods themselves. So it's similar yet different of how we saw kingship in other parts of the Near Eastern. It's just what we really sort of already talked about. So Ahura Mazda, you can see him here. He sort of shows up in a lot of the artwork. Very similar to sort of the depictions of Ashur in the Assyrians as a sort of like winged god. Although he is Ashur is always much smaller within the circle of the wings, whereas Ahura Mazda is always sticking out. That's one of the big ways you can tell the two of them apart. So like I said, the empire itself didn't have a true administrative center. There was no proper capital. Persepolis and Pasargadae had ceremonial palaces, while the court itself traveled between the royal cities of Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, which was modern Hamadan. And it was done on sort of a repetitive year-round schedule. Although Persepolis was more of a city as we know it than others, and it was probably closer to administrative center than the other ones were itself. The empire, though, was thoroughly multilingual. Aramaic was the written and administrative tongue, not Persian, interestingly enough. Achaemenid kings fostered and encouraged rituals of different local religions within the empire. Cyrus ordered the return of the Jews to Israel and ordered the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And these are just sort of a few examples of the many aspects in which the concept of empire are with the Persians is really sort of different than elsewhere, and also differently from the way Greeks really sort of portray them. Though we have enough evidence in our sources about Macedonians objecting to Persian customs, we're rarely told of the reverse situation. The Persians seem to be incredibly tolerant and really didn't give a shit what you did, which really sort of provides some food for thought, to say the least. So the establishment and maintenance of the Achaemenid Empire had sort of momentous consequences. First, the Achaemenid Empire was culturally and politically brought together through various Iranian groups and territories, and it sort of shaped Iranian identities, and in some respects becomes the model for the Hellenistic Empire in particular. Second, Achaemenid rule and the later campaigns of Alexander the Great, despite all of the continuities, brought about a real sort of metamorphosis for the ancient Near East. Up to that point, existing ethnic and cultural frontiers increasingly became or sorry, as we get into the Persian Empire, ethnic and cultural frontiers become more permeable. You know, there was still some separation, but after the Achaemenids, the Near East becomes much more culturally mixed, and it starts to become more of an amalgam rather than all these different cultural groups all together. Becomes much more of a melting pot. So just map showing you, so you can see the Pasargadae, Persepolis, Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana. Those are the royal cities that the sort of the capital kind of, or the court circled around. Then the other major cities as well as part of the empire was Sardis on the west hand coast, which was originally the Lydian capital, Memphis for Egypt, and then you have in Bactria, Zaraspa and in India, Takhila. So how the system really sort of worked. Few non-Persians were allowed to really sort of reach the highest political or military positions within the Persian Empire. That was left to the ethnic Persians and the Medes. But kings would entrust members of the local, you know, political elite, the provincial elite of the areas that they conquered, or even, you know, other foreigners with important tasks. They could be in charge of cities, they can be in charge of military outposts, they could take charge of, you know, constructions of roadworks and stuff like that. And in some respects, they kind of follow the same idea that the Assyrians did, was they let everybody benefit from honors and privileges, gifts, and everybody becomes wealthy. If everybody is doing well financially, there's less of a reason for them to revolt. Oh, geez, we're out of time. And sorry, there's a lecture across the hall that if you guys are interested in going to, by a guest from Iraq. So we'll finish off Iran next date.